Okay, so one more time, hello everyone. I think we can start with the second presentation for Hall D. Mr. Paul Jastrzebski, Oculus, please.
Hey guys, all right. Nice to meet everybody. So I'm Paul Jastrzebski. I'm Polish too, but I don't speak Polish very well, so I'm going to speak in English. But I work here at Oculus, and I have a talk today about what Oculus is working on, the state of VR, and some of the tips and learnings that we have in the year plus that the Oculus Rift has been in the market. So, quick question: how many of you guys are developers? Like, if you raise your hand, you're a developer. Cool. How many of you guys are like business people? A couple of business people? All right, cool, great. So let me tell you a little bit more about myself. So I work in what we call developer strategy at Oculus. So that means that we do everything that dealing with content creators, like the developers in the room. We deal with game publishers, game developers. We manage all aspects of the Oculus and content relationship. So that's what I do at Oculus. And my background is I started off as a tech and games journalist. Like, if you guys read video card reviews, I did that for about 5 years at like Hard OCP, Hot Hardware Firing Squad. I spent 7 years at NVIDIA, where I worked in developer relations and in marketing. And I've been at Oculus for about 3 years. So that's a little bit about me. Quick question, who knows what this is? That's the DK1. Okay, cool. How many of you guys have one of those? 2, 3, 3. Okay. That I was expecting more. So this is the first development kit that Oculus created. And so in this talk, I want to take you through a quick journey of the history of VR, so you kind of get a sense of where we're going as a platform and as a whole new industry. So that DK1 started off as a Kickstarter in August of 2012. It shipped to consumers in March 2013. And we shipped the first consumer Rift in March 2016, so a little over a year ago. How many of you guys have the CV1, the Oculus Rift? Okay, so there's a few of you guys that have that. That's great. And so to get you up to speed, when we shipped the Oculus Rift, we shipped it with a gamepad. So it didn't have native VR input. And we shipped Oculus Touch in December 2016, which was just about 6 months ago. And here we are in Digital Dragons. So this is kind of an interesting chart to look at, because what we're really talking about today is the start of a new industry, and this new industry has really just started in August of 2012. So it's less than 5 years old, and we're going to talk a little bit more about what it looks like today. So the cool news is that there's a whole bunch of VR platforms out there. Oculus is only one small part of the total VR ecosystem. As you guys can see, we've got Daydream, we have HTC Vive, there's the Oculus Rift, we have Sony PlayStation VR, we have Microsoft and Acer and a few other hardware partners going into the Microsoft ecosystem with their headsets. We have Starbreeze and their location-based VR, and we have Gear VR and mobile. And so the way that we kind of think about these different platforms is, one, we think this slide is awesome, because if it was just Oculus making VR headsets, we wouldn't be very successful. You'll never hear Oculus talk trash about anyone's VR headset, because we want everyone to succeed. We're in this early stage of this new industry that we're very cooperative with one another, and we're not really trying to see anybody fail, because we want this whole industry to succeed and survive. And within these different platforms, there's different business models. The Starbreeze folks and some of the Vive folks are more focused on location-based entertainment. Google is obviously focused on mobile, and Oculus is kind of an interesting player, because we do both. We do mobile and we do PC. And so I'm going to talk you guys through kind of the status of where we are as a platform, and as developers, some of the things that we've learned from the successful people on our platform that hopefully you can take away as you start looking at VR game development. So first and foremost, the Gear VR. How many of you guys think that there's like quality games on Gear VR? Have you raised your hand if you think there's anything good? There's like one. There's okay. There's one person that thinks that there's quality content in Gear VR. My take on what's happened in the Gear VR ecosystem, and how many of you guys have tried demos on the Gear VR? Okay, so most of the content that's traditionally been on mobile VR probably hasn't been that great, but with this new Gear VR controller that was announced a few months back, we think that's going to change. One of the challenges with mobile VR was that there was never a really good input device, and it was very passive. So games don't really work well on the touchpad that you have that ships in every Gear VR unit. But that's changed with the new game controller. And so I have a video that's going to prove that one guy right that raised his hand, that there is good content coming on mobile, and I'm going to talk you through that after I show you the video. So let's play this here. See if the audio works. Cool. So that video we created to show that the Gear VR content ecosystem has really changed, and we think that mobile VR is going to be the growth area for mainstream consumers. And so one of the challenges that we've had, like I mentioned, is that input was a problem, and input really made in-depth game experiences a challenge. But now that we have a controller, and Daydream has a great controller as well, you can have very deep experiences that have a variety of different input mechanisms. And so the way we think about Gear VR is it's almost like a relaunch of the mobile platform. We've already seen in the last month folks that have integrated the controller do very well with existing titles. The consumers that buy the Gear VR controller are spending a lot more money on content. And so if you guys are thinking about developing in the mobile ecosystem, you should certainly think about the new controller that's bundled in every single Gear VR. So that's kind of how the Gear VR looks. When it comes to content, we've also seen a lot of success stories. The Gear VR ecosystem has over 5 million units out there currently. A lot of those were even before the S8 launched last month. And there's many titles that have made over $1 million on the Gear VR platform. There's some interesting takeaways with these titles. Most of them were pre-controller, but the price points that we're seeing on mobile really fall in the $5 to $10 as a sweet spot to generate revenue. And so the other interesting thing about mobile is that we're starting to see a lot more pickup with in-app purchases. So what I'll do is I'll talk you through what we're seeing on the Rift, but the Gear VR is much more inclined, the users here are much more inclined to spend money on in-app purchases, and the consumer is going to be very different than what you have on the Rift and PC platforms. So Gear VR consumers tend to be a much wider audience because Samsung works with us to bundle the phone, or bundle the device with just about every phone that's sold. And so you have much more casual folks that like things like Ocean Rift. Ocean Rift is one of the first titles to launch on the Oculus Gear VR, and it has stayed in our top grossing charts for the last 2 years. So I think that's also something that's very interesting to look at. And when it comes to developing on Gear VR, one of the most important things as developers that I highly recommend is you should start with native VR development in mind. So the game design, the loops, the interactions are fundamentally different than you have in 2D games, especially mobile games. And so you have to design natively for the platform. Like I mentioned, the audience that we have is a lot more casual. A lot of the folks get a free Gear VR with the phone that they buy. And so they're not going to be as hardcore as the PC gaming Rift audience that we'll talk about in a second. We've also noticed that IP is actually kind of an interesting way to get people downloading your app. And some of our most popular applications are like mainstream consumer electronics and like entertainment apps like Jurassic Park. And so IP tends to draw mainstream consumers in. And session times are actually pretty low. So folks, when they play Gear VR games, they play them for 10 or 15, maybe 20 minutes at a time. Whereas on the Rift, you're going to see much longer session times. And the key thing that I would suggest whenever you're developing in the mobile ecosystem is do it on a low budget and do it on a short timeline. The Gear VR ecosystem has fundamentally changed in the last month because of the new controller. And so if you were, for example, designing a game that uses touch input instead of the new controller for the last year, you would find yourself in a market that has shifted into gamepad and into the controller, and you would make the wrong game on the platform. So that's what I would suggest on the Gear VR. And on the Oculus Rift, this has been a really interesting year because the Oculus Rift launched with the gamepad from Microsoft built into the box. And the platform has fundamentally changed since we launched the Oculus Touch controllers. And so I'm going to talk through some of the growth that we've seen, some of the successful content, and some of the opportunities that we see in the Rift going forward. So first of all, one of the challenges to just VR adoption is price. So when we launched the Rift back in March, we launched at $599, and we launched the Oculus Touch at $199. One of the things that we got from our research was that it was very expensive. And so we aggressively cut the price in March this year to $499 and $99. And we've seen tremendous uptake in consumer adoption. But one of the biggest pieces, and the reason why we're here today, is talk about content. So none of this matters unless there's really cool things to play in VR. And so, to that point, we've seen a really interesting ecosystem develop on the Oculus Rift when it comes to content. And most of it is actually new IP. And some of our most successful games are actually from the Polish development community. So Superhot's one of the most successful games on the Oculus Rift. Arizona Sunshine, Eagle Flight, I Expect You to Die. The interesting thing about this slide is looking at the price points in VR. There's a couple that are $50, $60 plus games, but most of the content that is selling well on the Oculus Rift is priced between $20 and $30. And so the reason why this is an important thing to talk about is that $20 to $30 games translate into usually like 12-month development cycles, and that's what we really recommend for any developer working in VR right now. You don't want to be spending 2+ years making a VR game because you want to get feedback from the community, and you want to get to really get your titles out there quickly so you can see if it's going to hit or not. It's such a new ecosystem that developing multi-year VR projects doesn't make financial sense, and you might miss out on some of the new trends that we're going to be talking about in a second. When it comes to the Rift, just like the Gear VR, every single one of those games was built natively for the platform. Superhot is kind of an interesting example because they reused a lot of the assets they had in the 2D game, but they fundamentally designed it natively for VR. High production quality is important. So art is important, but moderate budgets are key. So you will fail if you spend $5+ million on VR projects right now. But spending $1 million or so is kind of like the perfect mix of quality and budget. And then IP. So looking at that slide before, none of those titles were IPs that anyone knew about before the launch of VR. And that's what's really exciting about this new platform, this new industry. You as game developers and creators can create new IP, and you have this new audience that is looking for new experiences. And you have this opportunity to create and build new IP with this new emerging platform. And game length is actually really important too. So sometimes we hear developers talk about, hey, I want to make a game that's like 7-8 hours long. That's not a good idea. You want to be focused on 1 to 3 hours of gameplay right now. One, that you don't want to be spending that much time building games that have single-player campaigns of 8 hours or more. But two, it'll help you get out there and get in the market quicker and get feedback from the community. And the other bit we kind of touched on before is price point. So you want to have price point that reflect the value of the game. Oftentimes, developers try to add a VR tax to their experience or their app, where they're charging 20, 30, 40% more than the equivalent 2D app, and they fail. And so I would highly recommend looking at what the equivalent of a 2D experience might be, and then pricing that for VR. And so, here I think this is an interesting slide to talk about, like where we think we are in the market and how we see the market and the content emerging. We think that we're kind of in the early adopter phase of VR. So in the early adopter phase, the equipment is still expensive. The platforms are new. How many of you guys have tried to set up an Oculus Rift at home? Was it a good experience, or was it? Yeah, okay. Well, so we've tried hard to make it easy, but we found that regular consumers still have a hard time, getting their Windows drivers up and running, downloading updates, and so we think that the hardware is still in the early adopter phase. We have many hundreds of engineers working on new products at Oculus that are going to make the consumer experience a lot easier, but it's going to take some time to get there. On the content side, most of the content that we're seeing is still in the early experimentation phase. So still trying to solve locomotion, still trying to solve storytelling, still trying to solve different types of interactions. And so we're not quite at the point where we know what categories are going to be successful in VR. We've seen a lot of on-rails shooters. We've seen many adventure-style games, but we still don't have all the genres set for VR, which is really exciting for developers like yourselves. If you guys have new ideas, this is the time to experiment and create content in the space. And so, when we think about future content, like what types of things would be successful, one of the things that we've seen is that mechanics that are addictive can form really solid experiences. And so Superhot was really successful because they gave you the feeling that you're the guy from the Matrix. Space Pirate Trainer, Windlands had this amazing movement mechanic. And so finding mechanics is something that we highly recommend developers look for that are addictive and that are fun in VR. And oftentimes these mechanics don't work in 2D, so you have to really experiment. And whenever we talk to folks that are developing VR and they're asking us for funding, or they're just telling us about their project, we ask them what kind of mechanics make it special for VR that you can't have anywhere else. And so that's one of the things that we highly recommend all developers look for and find and build games around. And not only can you have addictive mechanics, but you also have to have strong game design. And so Shell Games is one of our favorite developers. They developed I Expect You to Die, and they're working on a number of other VR projects. And they're the guys that literally wrote the book on game design, modern game design. And so making sure that not only is there a mechanic, but there's story elements, and there's narrative, and there's strong game design behind the project. And the third is kind of it shouldn't be said, but you want to make things that will only work in VR. We're past the point where consumers are just delighted by being put in a VR headset, and we've had a number of games that were in the early days of VR that were ports of 2D content, and they just don't work well. You have to start from VR as a native design. And so some of the successes here is like Job Simulator. How many of you guys have played Job Simulator? Cool. So Job Simulator is one of the most fun games we have on our platform. And they designed a game around interaction. So the whole game is basically you're going in, you're picking up things, you're going in clipboards, and you're going into drawers. And they designed a game around those interactions. And you could only do that in VR. Like, that game would never work in 2D. Eve Valkyrie is another game that's designed in VR. This is designed for gamepad, but it's all about looking around. It's all about looking around in your cockpit. And you can't do that in 2D. So there will never be a 2D version of Job Simulator and of Eve Valkyrie. And you should think about that, because while some folks do want to design for both 2D and for VR, we haven't seen any games really successfully ship both 2D and VR versions at the same time. You just have to design for the platform. And all those key things are what we think is going to make future content successful. And so, what do we hope to see from developers like yourselves? And, where do we see the platform going? So one of the very first things that we love to talk about is just visuals and beauty in VR. But they don't have to be photorealistic. So Superhot is a great example of a beautiful game that has a really interesting art style, but it's not photorealistic. This is a picture of Land's End. This was one of the first titles that launched on the Gear VR platform, and it's the folks behind Monument Valley. And it's a beautiful game, but it doesn't have to be photorealistic. One of the first experiences that we show you when we show something called Dream Deck, when you buy an Oculus Rift, you're in a very, very low poly environment that just is really beautiful. And so art is important, but it doesn't have to be photoreal. But we do see our users, and Oculus gets really excited about stylized visuals. The other thing that we love seeing developers do, and this is where we think there's going to be a lot of potential to make an impact, is with new experimentation on interaction. So physics is really, really interesting in VR. Experimenting with the way you move around the world, the way you interact with the world, is something that we're still in the very, very early days of, and we think that there's just so much new ground to be discovered here, and that games will be developed once there's new experimented interactions that come up from R&D. And of course, social. So I think social is a really interesting experience to talk about, because there's been a lot of social VR games that have launched on the Oculus platform. And what we're seeing here is this is a picture of social, the Facebook social app. So I'm just curious, out of the folks that are developers right now, how many of you guys have thought about building a social VR app? Okay, we have two. Okay, all right. Well, one of the challenges about social VR, and this is one of the things that you don't really hear too much, but I do want to make sure that all the developers in the room understand, is that in the early days of VR, concurrency is an issue. So we've had multiple titles launch, like Eagle Flight, Sports Bar VR, that require multiple people to be in a session at one time. And in the early days of VR, if your game design requires concurrency, you're going to have a lot of problems, because it's hard to get this new market, get all these people online at the same time and trying to play the same game at the same time. You can do things like join in progress, where if you start a session like in Sports Bar VR, people can join while you're in it, and that will help you join multiplayer games. But although, we absolutely fully believe in social experiences as one of the big pillars of the future of VR, it's still an issue in the early days. And so for those of you that are curious, Oculus is owned by Facebook, but Facebook is building out its own social applications and platforms on top of the Oculus platform. So Facebook Spaces, and it's out right now on the Rift, is actually not really being worked on by anyone at Oculus. That's being done by Facebook. The other really interesting thing that I would suggest that folks look at is bringing emotions out in VR experiences. VR is just such an intimate medium that you can have these intimate experiences that that you really you don't have in other platforms. Like not just like being scared, but feeling angry, feeling joy. There's just a lot of really interesting things that you can do with intimacy, and this is one of the like a really interesting title called Res Infinite, and in it, one of the experiences that you have is there's like a very interesting like motherly figure in it that brings out a lot of emotions if you go through the experience that we really like. And the last one is just fun. There's a guy named Tyler Hurd that builds like these VR dance applications, and it's like you're in a music video. I would show you guys, but I would recommend you take a look at this app. It's just a lot of fun. You have your hands moving around. You have all these guys dancing. And whenever we look at content, we always think about, is this thing going to be fun or not? And we want consumers to come back to VR and to keep enjoying their time in the space. And so we do look for fun. So, like as developers and as business people here, I do want to talk about, how to work with Oculus, what we look for in funding, is exclusivity important, and all the ways you can interact with us. So the way that we're set up is similar to how Steam is set up. We have a store, and the majority of the content that is on the Oculus store is not funded by Oculus in any way. So the majority of the content is submitted through organic submissions through our store. We have an editorial team that is similar to the editorial team at Apple that takes the submissions in, features the things that we think our users are going to like, and we have over 400 things in the Rift store. But there are ways that you can talk to Oculus, and you do it through people like me, if you have new interesting concepts that maybe need some funding. And we have a grant program that we work with developers all over the world, and we can sometimes cover 5 to 10% of production budgets to help you get over the hump and help ship titles. And so the way that works is you show us a prototype. We're beyond the stage of funding anything that looks like a PowerPoint presentation. With the progresses of Unity and Unreal, it's so easy to build in VR that if you have ideas on what you want to build, you have to show it to us. We won't be funding anything that's just like a PowerPoint presentation. But we're very open, especially hitting all those different topics that we covered, like really interesting visuals, fun experimental interactions, just emotions. We want to see content that hits all of those pieces, and Oculus is here because we want to support the Polish and Central European development community, and we have funding to give folks that are interested in exploring the space. So I'm sure that there's going to be some questions about what we do, so I'll leave it to questions, and that's my email address. I'm going to be here for the next 2 days. Our goal of being here is just to support VR development in this part of Europe. And we want to see more super hots out there, and I think that there's a lot more coming out of this part of Europe. And so I'll leave it to any questions that you guys might have.
Do you have right now any questions? Okay.
Hi, Paul. Thanks for the talk. I would like to ask you a question because this year, around March, I may misspell the name, but Brendan Ira mentioned that we should not expect any new Oculus hardware in like 2 years frame. Would you say something more about that?
Yeah, well, it's like, of course I can't say like what exactly we're working on, but you can expect the Rift to be around for a while. It's not like, the cycle is not like a graphics card where we're going to be replacing it every year or so. It's going to be, the Rift is going to be there for a long time. That's all I can say.
Thank you.
Hello, I have a couple of questions, so should I ask them all together or?
Sure.
All right. So the first one was about the sales, maybe the Gear VR. In terms of how many number of units are there in the space versus the Rift ones, because for me it was kind of hard to find a really strong and like real data.
Yeah, so there's we said that there's over 5 million gears sold, and it's well over 5 million. But what we can't tell you like publicly in a space like this is like where we're at on the Rift. The Rift is much smaller. But it's certainly a very healthy ecosystem, especially with the price drops that we've had. I'm happy to kind of give you an indicator, but we can't do it in like a public forum.
All right. The second question was about the pricing for Gear VR. So you said $5 to $10, but when you look at the statistics on the app stores and stuff, the average price for a game on a mobile platform is 45 cents. So how this translates to the users that are there?
Yeah, it's a little bit of a different platform versus traditional mobile. So is that what you're referring to, or?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's a very different platform. We're seeing consumers are willing to spend $5 and $10, whereas they're not willing to spend that on Android 2D or on iOS. And so it's actually my thought that like if the content is really, really high quality, you can probably even get higher price points. And I think that Gear VR is certainly a standout right now. That said, not everything can really hit that quality bar. You really have to invest in the experience to get there.
The next one was about Rift, and again about the pricing a bit, because you mentioned that the pricing that maybe we should be aiming is $20 to $30. On the other hand, you also mentioned the average game length would to be between 1 and 3 hours, and I can imagine, and maybe I did some research and stuff, but it seems like if you release a game for the length of it is like 1 hour, 1.5, which is maybe in the brackets, right? And you price it around $20, you're gonna get a huge backlash, even if it's maybe high quality and stuff. Like after 1 hour of gameplay, if you pay $20, I think people basically are more spoiled than this.
Yeah. I think like you have to price it fairly for what it is. And so when we say $20 to $30, that tends to be higher, in that 2, 3, 4 hour time frame. But certainly if it's an hour long and you're charging $30, people are not going to be happy. The best way that we guide folks is that price it what the equivalent value is on 2D, like on a Steam. Because it's a lot of the same PC enthusiast community users, and you don't want to overprice, because that will really tank reviews and consumers won't like it.
All right, and the last question maybe is about the exclusivity that you mentioned, but
yeah, so exclusivity is not really important to us. We do have a studios division that produces our own exclusive content. But when we talk to third parties, we're not trying to sign up and give people buckets of cash to get exclusives so that our competitors don't get the titles. We do find ways, there might be some kind of co-marketing partnership that we do on a title, but we're no longer trying to basically buy up a bunch of exclusive games, because it kind of goes back to how we see the competition and how we see the industry. We're not at the point where we want to lock in everything, and we actually kind of have seen that locking exclusives up hurts developers, and we want folks to hit as many platforms as possible because we want developers to sustain themselves in VR.
Okay, someone else? Starting from the back. Yeah.
I want to ask about wireless Rift. Is it any release date exist now? And chance that it will be like add-on for existing hardware?
Yeah, the thing that we did show at Oculus Connect, which was our conference, is we showed a prototype of what that looks like. But it's we can't announce anything here, and it's one of those R&D projects that we're absolutely working on. We do believe that the Gear VR is already a wireless device, and we think that wireless is certainly a big part of the future of VR. But we've shown some prototypes of it, but we don't have anything to announce. I'm sorry.
I have two questions about two platforms. So starting with the Rift, will there be something like you already told us that there will be no new version of the Oculus, but right now HTC Vive has improved the production of their units. They are using different plastic, and the Vives being produced right now are a little bit better than a few months ago. So will this happen with the Oculus? Because on behalf of my company, we have a small problem with the Oculus connectors. We already broke, I think, 3 Oculus because of the connectors.
Yeah.
So will those be improved?
I don't know exactly. I honestly do not know. There's no plans for like major changes. But as it comes to any type of manufacturing process, I know they're always tweaking it. But it's not going to change substantially. I don't think the materials are going to change or anything like that.
Okay. And another question is about this Gear VR remote. So I've tested it and I've compared it with the Daydream controller, and I find Daydream controller a little bit better because it does not lose tracking such often as this controller from Samsung and Gear VR. And my another question is it still work in progress, or do you consider it?
No. We consider it. So that's an interesting piece of feedback, because a lot of the folks that we talk to like wildly prefer it over the Daydream controller because it has a trigger and it has more possibilities on the thumb input. But that is the final one. So that's the consumer version.
Okay, I was just asking about the software updates. For
Oh yeah, there's
firmware.
all yeah,
Okay.
absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Someone else? Okay.
Hello. I have a question about Oculus Home, and the question is that do you plan, maybe in near or far future, to open Oculus Home to other VR platforms like HTC Vive or anything what comes in the future?
That's a good question. One of the things I didn't really talk about is like the software that we're doing to improve the home experience. So for those of you guys that had the Gear VR, if you played with the Gear VR like a year ago and you get into Oculus Home now, it's like 2 or 3 times faster because we've completely re-architected it and it runs a lot smoother. On the PC, we're also adding a whole bunch of new features. Are we going to allow HCC users to use Oculus Home? I don't know. We haven't decided, that, and we haven't announced anything like that, and we wouldn't do that like here. But we're constantly improving it. You're going to see a lot of new features coming this year into Oculus Home. But that specific, are we going to let them use that? I don't have an answer to that right now. But I will say, stay tuned. You're going to see a lot more features in Oculus Home very soon.
But what about Vulkan support on VR? Because on mobile, Vulkan is so much improvement on performance.
So on that specifically, I don't have an answer, but I can get you one. We have a separate group that's our engineering group that's working on things of that sort. I don't have that to share right now. But I know that we're looking at Vulkan.
Someone else? Okay.
One more hardware question. How would you describe a penetration of touch controllers among the Vive, I'm sorry, Rift users?
Really high. It's very high. Like, I can't tell you exactly what it is, but I will tell you that the majority of the people that are buying the Rift are buying touch with it. It's just kind of like the thing that you want to do when you buy a Rift, and so if you're a developer and you're trying to figure out, oh, do I make a game that supports touch or do I make a game that supports gamepad? Highly recommend you go for the touch. We're seeing very, very high attach rates, and that's partly why we wanted to drop the price point. We realized that at $200 it was still a little high for input, so we dropped the price point $9. So I think what you'll see is a very, very close one-to-one, close to that going forward.
Something more? Okay.
You mentioned about the iterations of the hardware. Are you going for are you planning to release like a slimmed down version, like a less? I can imagine like an iteration that has less weight, like with consoles and maybe less cables and stuff like that. Is like the same features, but
so we can't like talk about what is coming. But the plan is, like Brendan said, we're not going to be, the Rift is the Rift. And so I would continue just thinking what we have now as the primary platform.
3 more minutes. I don't know if you have any questions. If not,
anyone else?
Yeah. So thank you very much.
Yeah, and the thing I'll say tomorrow, if you guys are working on the Gear VR, I have some of those controllers, so I'll bring them tomorrow. You can send me an email if you want one. I have a few of them. I don't think you can buy them in Poland yet, so we brought some.
Thank you very much one more time.
Yeah.
Please remember
Thank
that
you
you can access the presentation of Paul at our application. Thank you very much.